Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I have a living legend in German language academics with me, Dr. Friedrich Glasl. If you have ever worked on or with conflict prevention and conflict management theories, you must have come across Dr. Glasl's work. He's the father of the so-called conflict escalation model, which can be applied to anything from interpersonal conflicts all the way to international warfare, which is actually going to be the topic of today's talk. Dr. Glasl was born in Vienna in 1941. He dedicated his academic work to researching conflicts and organizational systems, getting his PhD in international conflict prevention in 1967. Later, he ventured into the field of economics and management theory, building up his own management consultancy in which he applied his theory to improve companies and help them manage conflicts. One of the keys to his work is understanding that conflicts themselves are not bad, but that they need to be managed and resolved responsibly instead of through strategies of violence. Dr. Glasl, talking to you is a great honor. So thank you for coming online today.
You're welcome. Yeah.
So I usually have relatively free discussions, but with you, I just have so many questions that I wrote down down all of them, and I'm sorry if I will sound a little bit robotic, but I would really like to start first with your background and a few of your thoughts on war and peace. And especially also the academic study of conflict. So let's just dwell a little bit on your background. You were just a baby during World War II, but did the war and Austria being part of the German Reich, as well as the subsequent occupation of Austria, influence your personal development, working and thinking? And what has been your motivation to dedicate your life to the study of conflicts and organizations?
Mm-hmm. Well, the war has tremendous influence. Growing up in Vienna, which was bombed, etc., and my father did not survive. He died in March 45. He was as a soldier in France, in the German army in France, and was sent back to die at home. And then I grew up in the city which was occupied. I grew up in the Russian section, like Berlin. We were divided in 4 sections. So the American, British, French, and Russian. And there I saw also daily violence, actually. And also the youth gangs after the war were rather violent. And you can imagine we played in the ruins and with destroyed tanks, etc., in the parks in Vienna, etc. And the young people, or the youth, just imitated more or less what they have observed during their youth. And then I became very interested in peace and war, especially the question, how is it possible that people become so cruel and so violent and destroy each other's lives and property, etc. And it never, well, I couldn't find an answer for this. So I became interested in politics because I understood, of course, what happened there in Germany and Austria, the Nationalsozialismus, the Nazis, etc., in ideology of violence and of occupation and suppression, etc. And I became very much interested in the causes of the Second World War. And then I decided, when I was 18, to become a conscientious objector. In Austria, obligatory military service was introduced just 1 year before I had to be investigated, etc. So I became conscientious objector. It was recognized by a committee, and then I felt well, it's not enough that I try to keep out of violence, but you could also learn to do something to prevent violence. And I was mainly thinking of this on the international field, the war. And therefore, I decided to study political science, which I did, focusing on international relations, international law, international organizations. That was also the topic later of my doctorate thesis. And the main question was, what can international communities like the League of Nations before the Second World War or the United Nations, what can they do when they observe growing tensions leading to conflict, to prevent it or to intervene, different kinds of measures and sanctions and even military actions, etc. And when I studied for 1 year, then I discovered it's not enough just to look at the international dynamics. I should also study psychology. So I added psychology to political science. I did not finish psychology. I finished political science, but I was reading all important lectures and seminars, etc. So at the end, I had an offer to start with research work in international relations and politics. I was invited to go to Berlin University, but at the same time, I got an invitation to the Netherlands. Just simply, my wife was Dutch, or is Dutch. We are still married for 57 years now. And her brother was busy in an institute which was connected to the Dutch university, economic university in Rotterdam. And this institute had developed and practiced and studied and was teaching organization development, which was interesting because in addition to my study, I was also working to earn money because when I lost my father and so, there was no money at home and so, etc. So I financed my study, worked in printers' offices and in public administration and in publishing companies. And therefore I had various experiences in working within an organization, also in a low management position. So I was very glad to emigrate to the Netherlands with my wife. And then the reason why I have been invited by this institute in Rotterdam was that they said, whenever we become invited to do consulting work in terms of organization development, the reason in most cases is a hidden conflict or an open conflict. So organization development can't start or can't proceed without conflict management work, conflict resolution work. In those times, mediation was not a fashionable term. It was only for international affairs, international mediation, good services, bon office, etc. And so this interested me very much to do practical work, not just study on a high theoretical level, but also to apply science, which I did from the very first day in that institute and successful in combination with experienced colleagues. So that's my background. And then I stayed for 19 years in the Netherlands and became one of the 3 most requested or famous conflict resolution experts in the Netherlands, but also in the English-speaking world and in German-speaking countries.
it's very important to understand that your theories of conflict resolution in the German-speaking part of Europe is the standard work, because you were the man who invented or who thought up this very methodological approach towards analyzing and then managing conflicts. And maybe
that's important, yeah.
And management.
Yeah.
And just let me ask you, like, compared to when you started, how far has conflict management and the understanding of how conflict comes, how conflict happens, evolved? Can you, like, is it a big difference, or is there still a lot that needs to be resolved?
I can tell you, when I did the research work for my doctorate thesis on international level, so there existed 4 theories for escalation, but only one was a real Herman Kahn, famous expert in political science. Only Herman Kahn described what was going on in social systems, while other theories consisted of, well, at the beginning, people don't recognize that there is a tension. And then second step is they become aware there's a tension. And the third step is so and so, but not describing what's going on in the social system, only what's going on in an observer or intervening person, maybe. So rather useless. And then when I started to more or less to transfer this to the organizational level, then I had to actually to start more or less new. I could use Herman Kahn's model, but Herman Kahn's model consisted of 42 steps compared to my 9 steps, rather complicated. But from step 20 onwards in Herman Kahn's model, the difference of the following steps are only described by the growing killing capacity or destructive capacity of the arms you're using. And of course, whether you use it means you have to decide, and you have to anticipate what the consequences could be, of course. But this was, of course, this could not be used in organization conflicts. And in the first steps, for me, the most interesting was, what are the implicit, the implicit unexpressed formulas to which people refer actually when they decide, now I escalate, I go further. And by this, I discovered the thresholds, and in my work, hundreds of complex cases which I had to use for my research work, those which I had as a consultant, those of my colleagues. And in those days in the Netherlands, I also was what was called main lecturer on an inter-university faculty on organizational sciences. And there, every year, I had about 40 students, those who already were having a job and working in organizational consulting work, mainly within organizations like Philips or the Rails or governmental organizations. And they had to use their own cases to be analyzed and to develop strategies for conflict resolution, which I did and I supervised, etc., together with them. So this was actually the basis. But when I started the existing literature on conflicts in organization, look at my hand, was all the books together was so much. And I had the complete literature on organizational conflicts in my bookshelf, on my bookshelf. Yeah, not more. And the most were American writers.
Yeah.
Some from Sweden, some from England, almost nobody from Germany or German language. Yeah.
And the beautiful thing is that in your theory, you can link up individual conflicts to
Yeah.
organizational conflicts to international conflicts, because you figured out how they interlink. And we will go into this in just a second.
Yeah.
But before we do that, one more question about the development of what you have witnessed over the past 60 years. You know, that's a real question on my mind. We have now 100 years, basically since 1918, since the end of the First World War. We've had a parallel development. International law went to outlaw war and make it illegal, and we've created a lot of institutions to deal legally with war. The International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, you name it. We have a lot of them. The United Nations today is, of course, one huge organization in a legal way,
etc.
And at the same time, we also had the invention of international relations. That thing is also only 100 years old, when where people try to figure out what are the mechanisms of power politics and so on, and tame war. But for the entire century, we have failed to attain that. We're back now. I mean, war has never left us. How do you explain that, or why do you think that is?
Well, I have my ideas on it, and unfortunately, this hypothesis confirmed again and again. The basic idea is hegemonial dynamics. That means that nations or governments, not nations, governments actually, pretending to represent the nation's will, that they are striving to be the most powerful, the number one, to actually to control economy, etc. And for this, you need political power and military power. And exists an interesting theory that if there is a competition of governments or nations or governments, and two or three are actually competing in becoming number one, and all have chances to do this by establishing a colonial empire, or to invest in the navy or the army or whatsoever. And if there is a situation in which the competing nations or governments are expecting they can grow and they can win, then the danger of a war is much, much less than in a situation in which one is uprising and the other actually is losing power or dominance, which at the moment, if you look at the United States, who have been the police agency of the world for a long time, and also determining for a great deal the international rules of behavior, either in economy or in international law, to a great extent. And now the power of the United States actually is
waning.
Yeah. On the other hand, we have the China. And I mean, the competition which existed between the Soviet Empire and the USA, we remember both expected to be able to grow. So look at the space research, etc., and Sputnik and Gagarin, etc., and who would do the first steps on the moon, etc. So there, the danger of a military clash is much less than if the one is actually declining and the other is rising, like China. If you look at the BRICS, for instance, China, Russia, South Africa, which just happened the last days in South Africa. This is more dangerous because the power which observes that they are losing more and more power and influence is inclined actually to defend what they have got by any rate.
Yeah.
So we have then the imperialistic dynamics now of all who are involved in the hegemonial strife, competition, but this is really a great danger. And
interesting.
when you ask me, well, we have you can say mankind made tremendous progresses in terms of International Court of Justice and of the League of Nations and United Nations and OSCE and other regional security and peace systems, etc., architecture. And if you look at my slides where I present an overview of good developments, of cooperation, of trust, and of control of armament or disarmament, and so, but then also more and more violations of treaties, of international law in general, etc., again by attempts to neglect the United Nations mandate, for instance, or to change it, like USA with Libyan, for instance, they had a mandate for a humanitarian intervention, and they used it for overthrowing the Gaddafi government, etc., which was not the mandate, etc. Or if you look at if Russia occupying parts of Georgia, for instance, or Chechnya, and if you look at the United States with Saddam Hussein and the invasion in Iraq, and so on and so on. So you could see it on my slides, but
yes.
But this is, I would say, still in the time when there was the expectation of the competing parties, they might be able to grow.
Right.
Yeah.
So the hegemonic peace theory and hegemonic competition theory.
Yeah.
And